Delivering the crime statistics for the Q4 period from January to March 2025. Police Minister Senzo Mchunu said that gender-based violence and femicide remain a serious concern in communities. Now, he emphasized that the launch of the 90-day GBV+F Blitz, which began on 1 May, was underway, including resolving bottlenecks and ensuring measurable progress. And this morning, we discuss whether South Africa is losing the fight against crime, and particularly GBV, with activist and cyber lawyer Diana Schwartz and Not in My Name national organizer Boitumelo Thage. Good morning, Diana.
Good morning, Mr. Chaba. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, and good morning, Boitumelo.
Good morning, Ms. Chaba, and thank you for having me too.
Firstly, Diana, before we can get into these tragic news about Olerato, I'd like to talk about this as a lawyer. Why would the court system allow two suspects with a history of kidnapping and robbery to be released on bail, given the potential risks to public safety?
That is a very good question, Mr. Chaba, and I think that we have seen quite often that this is the case. And the stricter bail conditions that we sought to remedy with the main gender-based violence and harassment bills in 2020 seem to be not being enforced in terms of what they sought to remedy. So this is a big question mark, and clearly there is a gap in terms of the legislation and the law enforcement, which not only goes from SAPS on the ground, but all the way up to the National Prosecuting Authority and the judiciary.
All right, and Boitumelo, as a representative of Not in My Name, how do you think that this case highlights the broader issues of GBVH in South Africa?
Thank you, Ms. Chaba, for the question. You would note that a few months ago, a month ago, there was a countrywide uproar for the Justice for Tlekwe case, the 7-year-old girl who was raped. And during that period, there was the release of Omotoso, who was arrested 8 years ago for countless charges of gender-based violence and rape. And then now we're dealing with a case of a young girl whose life was taken away from her in the most gruesome and violent manner. And we, as Not in My Name, believe that this is just a consistent show from the justice system and the National Prosecuting Authority that the women and children in South Africa are not safe. And I think Diana would obviously have a better understanding from the legal side that this also shows that victims in South Africa who are prone to or prospective victims of violence would likely be living in a sense of fear in South Africa as opposed to the perpetrators, because for us the fact that the men who were arrested a few months ago for a similar crime of kidnapping were released on bail just shows us that perpetrators are more likely to be safer in South Africa than the victims.
Now, Diana, you mentioned that there's a gap in terms of legislation. Do you think that the bail conditions set for these suspects were adequate, given their alleged crimes and the risk of them committing further offenses? And also, do you think that the current bail system prioritizes public safety sufficiently?
Unfortunately, the answer to that question is no, I don't think so. I do not think that our courts and our law enforcement is actually enforcing the legislation to the fullest extent. Certainly, they need to be revised again, and the implementation and the enforcement thereof certainly needs to be revised, and there certainly needs to be stricter bail conditions. When one argues a bail application, you look at the mitigating and aggravating factors of the perpetrator being allowed back into society or being held pending trial. Clearly, in these instances, these perpetrators have committed gender-based violence and harassment offences before and should not have been let out on bail. I think it's so clear, and I cannot understand how that was actually allowed to happen.
All right, and I'd like to ask you, Boitumelo, I mean, it's striking how often we need hashtags to bring attention to issues such as gender-based violence. So what do you believe are the root causes of GBV in South Africa?
Thank you, Ms. Chaba. I think the root cause of gender-based violence in our country is the fact that we live in a country where it is the victims who need to prove beyond reasonable doubt that whatever crime has happened to them, in this sense being GBVF or rape, and I think Not in My Name believes that it needs to be the other way around. It needs to be perpetrators who prove beyond reasonable doubts, because the fact that it's so easy for perpetrators to receive bail of 1,000 rand or of 2,000 rand after committing such heinous crimes shows us that victims' stories don't matter. And we also have a belief that the fact that we know of so many victims, but we don't know where these perpetrators are, is also a show that society is protecting some of these victims. So we have a belief that we need to start calling out perpetrators of gender-based violence and rape, but we also, moreover, need to call on police officers, law enforcement, to ensure that they have more stricter conditions in terms of how they deal with the bail issue. In fact, we call as Not in My Name to say that we don't want any bail for perpetrators up until such a time that that particular person is proven innocent. But in the instance that they are still a suspect or they're still a perpetrator, we want them to be kept in jail up until such a time that they are sentenced. And then lastly, we also have a belief that the police system needs to be more empathetic to victims of gender-based violence and not to perpetrators, because the fact that, and we've been saying this for so many years, that victims go to police stations but are treated with so much secondary victimization is the reason why they either go back, live in silence, or it creates a culture that women and children need to just remain silent. So we're calling for more empathetic police officers. We're calling for the police themselves to be policed. If needs be, they should go for training again, and in that training, they need to be taught how to be empathetic to the plight of women and children in South Africa. Thank you.
And I love that you brought up the matter of family members and people around these criminals, because this speaks to social morality, you know, because in this particular case, it's been alleged that the mother of who's been basically named as the main suspect who was killed in a standoff with the police had basically given him a tip-off, and he could have potentially been arrested on Wednesday had it not been for the mom giving him this tip-off. Now, I'll come back to you, Diana. Are South African prisons effectively rehabilitating offenders, or are they simply warehousing people?
So I don't think that we have a proper rehabilitation process for offenders. I think that's something that needs to be addressed, certainly, because obviously, once someone has served their time, because not everybody is going to get a life sentence, they need to be rehabilitated. They need to be taught, you know, before they're released back into society. And there needs to be a review process in place that actually looks at that before someone is released. But I think before we can even go there, we have to start at the start, like Boitumelo has said. And we need to actually train our law enforcement. Again, we need training. Falcop Cyber Legal, for example, we provide training to law enforcement on, you know, privacy, cybersecurity, GBVH, that kind of thing, so that they can know what the law says, how to prosecute offences, how to treat victims, and how to then, the case should go to the NPA, what evidence needs to be presented. How does the NPA then prosecute successfully? And even up to the judiciary, how do they sentence effectively to stop this epidemic in our country? That's the only way that we are going to stop this from happening.
That's a very valid point about how the NPA can, you know, successfully prosecute, because, I mean, we've seen recently in the case of Pastor, or rather Omotoso, you know, being acquitted, which is an epic failure. But I want to know from you, Boitumelo, what's missing in the conversation that prevents meaningful change from happening to address GBV and the killing of women? What needs to be done?
Thank you so much, Ms. Chaba. I think that what needs to be done right now, because I think now we're living probably in the worst time, and it's a consistent occurrence, because 2019 there was Uyinene, a few years before that there was Karabo Mokoena. So it's as if we're in a cycle that's never ending. I have a strong belief that government needs to start holding themselves accountable, as opposed to saying, we're going to have a 16 days of activism, we're going to do a 90-day Imbizo, or whatever the case may be. What we want from government now is the same urgency that they had during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, where they went on a national disaster, state of emergency, and all of these things that they put into place to ensure that the citizens of South Africa would be safe from the pandemic. We want that same energy for gender-based violence, and we don't want a situation whereby they give us a campaign, but we don't see the result of that particular campaign, because we've been having 16 days of activism for as long as I can remember. But all it is now is seminars and conferences and you'd want to say in high-ranked places in the main, but we don't see where exactly this is happening. And this is happening, unfortunately, in township areas. We need to deal with this from the roots, number one. And we also have a belief, because Not in My Name now deals with helping children, educating children around speaking up and raising their voices. So we want the government to augment all nonprofit organizations that deal with educating communities, especially where this is happening, going into schools and making sure that we're teaching communities about what consent is, number one, and number two, obviously ensuring that they know how the process of opening a case is, because you'd be surprised how many people in communities don't know how to do something as simple as opening a case. But also, more importantly, I'd want to emphasize it, is the police being more empathetic. And lastly, I think maybe to say that we need to then have government putting nonprofit organizations at the forefront of the fight, but not leaving it only up to nonprofit organizations, ensuring that they fund the fight. There was a campaign to say fund the fight a few years ago. So we want to see where that funding is going, and we want an account of where that funding has gone. We don't want to just be told that, no, we've given out R1 billion, but we don't know where that R1 billion has gone. So that's what we'd want. Thank you.
All right, Diana. Now, two of the suspects were out on bail for another crime. Two alleged suspects in the murder of Olerato. Now, it would seem like a logical thing for me for this to be publicized. If somebody who's been involved in a violent crime, allegedly, is out on bail, surely we should all know. So what measures do you think can be taken to prevent suspects from committing further crimes while out on bail?
So I think that, first of all, we've come a little bit further down the line, thank goodness, where the National Sex Register is now going to be publicized. It wasn't publicized before. So that's a good step in the right direction. However, I think that if a criminal has been convicted of a previous crime and is allowed out on bail, there needs to be monitoring by law enforcement. So there should be something like an ankle bracelet or house arrest or something like that to, perturb them from going ahead and being out in society and communities and just being able to then commit crime again or reoffend. So those kind of conditions should certainly be considered, not be considered, they should be actually put into force and put into place.
All right. So in closing, and just to close off with you, Boitumelo, Diana had mentioned that there is a gap in terms of legislation. Do you think that the current laws and policies in South Africa are sufficient to address GBVH, or are there changes that need to be made?
I think maybe, Maschara, for that, we'd say we need more policies and legislations around GBVF. But we also need more institutionalized policies, and I'm referring to in institutions of higher learning in schools that protect learners and students on campus, at school. But we also need sexual harassment policies in the workplaces. But in the sense of what happens in the instance that a girl child is raped, or even a boy child is raped or abused by a teacher on campus, or a lecturer, or whatever the case may be, because we found that there is no sexual harassment policies for students on campus, and this happens a lot of the times. It happens on campus. So what responsibilities are universities and schools taking? And the perfect example would be the 7-year-old case for Kwekwe, the school, what responsibility would it have had to take? And if I believe if there was a sexual harassment policy, we would have been able to hold the school accountable in a better sense. And then I think also in terms of the overall legislation, because you'd know that the legislation obviously would cover all angles at schools or in workplaces. We'd want to say that there needs to be a legislation that speaks to what happens to a victim in this instance or that instance.
Ladies, thank you so much for your time.